Today we have some more actual history about the very first American family to settle in Travis County, Texas. They surveyed a spot for Austin's colony that was further west up the Colorado River than any place that had yet been settled, and in 1832, Reuben and Sarah Hornsby, along with their 7 children, settled on what is now known as Hornsby's Bend, which is just northeast of the Austin-Bergstrom International Airport. A few other families soon came to settle nearby. In this episode, we will hear about an attack by Indians, probably Comanches, on the Hornsby settlement in May of 1836, shortly after Texas won its independence from Mexico. We will be reading from this book, Indian Depredations in Texas, by J.W. Wilbarger. This book was published all the way back in 1889. So here's the story of the 1836 Comanche raid on the home of Reuben and Sarah Hornsby, just east of present-day Austin, Texas. Reuben Hornsby was amongst the earliest settlers of Austin's upper colony. There were only a few who preceded him, possibly only 2 or 3 families. Jacob Howell was his nearest neighbor, we believe, and in 1836 there were only 5 families living in what was generally known as the Hornsby settlements. These families were headed respectively by Reuben Hornsby, Jacob Harrell, Joe Duty, Kastner, and Weber. The latter lived at Weber's Prairie some 6 or 7 miles from Hornsby, but in those days they would be considered near neighbors. It was in the spring of 1836, when the settlers were fleeing from the invading army of Santa Anna, that Captain John Tumlinson sent 3 young men, named Williams, Haggett, and Kane, to the Hornsby settlement to assist in protecting and moving the families above named out of reach of the invading Mexicans. The settlers had finished planting their corn, and upon the arrival of the escort sent out by Captain Tumlinson, the settlers at once prepared for flight. They struck Little River and proceeded down that stream beyond the mouth of the same, until they reached the old town of Nashville on the Brazos, where the International and Great Northern Railroad now crosses the Brazos River. Upon arriving at this point, they learned for the first time that Santa Anna had been defeated and captured at San Jacinto on the 21st of April. They immediately, upon the receipt of this glorious news, proceeded on down the Brazos until they struck the old San Antonio Road, at the historic little village of Ten Oaks Talon, on the Brazos River, and taking the San Antonio Road, came on back to the town of Bastrop, and from thence up the Colorado River to the Hornsby settlements. They had only been home a few days when about 10 o'clock one bright morning, in the early part of May, while Williams and Haggett were in one part of the field hoeing and thinning corn, and the Hornsby boys and Kane were working in another portion, about 100 Indians rode up to the fence near where Williams and Haggett were at work, threw down the fence and marched in, bearing a white flag hoisted on top of an Indian lance. The wily Indians expecting by this mean to throw the young men off their guard, and in this they were successful. They rode up to where the young men were at work, forming a circle around them as they drew nearer, shook hands in an apparently friendly manner with the boys, and then commenced their bloody work. One of the young men was speared to death where he stood, but the other succeeded in breaking through the circle, but was shot to death before he had run but a few steps. While this work was being carried on by the Red Devils, the young men working in the other part of the field were fast making tracks in another direction. When the attack was made, Billy Hornsby was plowing a yoke of steers, and was about midway of the row when his brothers Malcolm, Reuben, and Joe, and Kane, who had been down to the river to get some water, discovered the Indians just as they were rising to the top of the bank. Billy had his back to the Indians and had not seen them, and the first intimation he had of their presence was the alarm given by the boys as they ascended the river bank. He left his team standing hitched to the plow, and made for the river to join his brothers and Kane. Before proceeding further, let us take a peep into the little log cabin, the home of Mr. Hornsby, and see what was going on there all this time. Hornsby was sitting in the house in company with his wife, and his little son Thomas, a lad some 5 years of age, and Miss Cynthia Kastner. In playing around, the child happened to go out on the porch, or old-fashioned gallery as they were usually called, and discovered the Indians in the distance. He ran back into the room and said, "Pa, come see what a heap of Indians out yonder on the hill." But the old gentleman paid no attention to the little fellow. He again went out and looked, and by this time the number of men had greatly increased. He ran into the room again and said, "Pa, there is a heap more. Come see." He kept on repeating this until Mrs. Hornsby said to her husband, "Do go and look what it is the child has seen." "Oh," replied Mr. Hornsby, "I don't suppose he has seen anything." Nevertheless, he got up and went to the door, and then, to his astonishment, he saw that a large party of Indians were in close proximity to the house. Seeing them approaching Williams and Haggart, he gathered up his gun and the 2 guns of the young men, and started to their assistance. But he had gone but a short distance when he turned back, seeing that all attempt to aid the unfortunate young men would be useless, as the Indians had already surrounded them. Mrs. Hornsby and Miss Cynthia Kastner, in order to induce the Indians to believe that the house was well guarded, dressed themselves in men's apparel, and walked about the yard with Mr. Hornsby with guns in their hands. No doubt the warlike appearance and demonstrations of these courageous women dampened the ardor of these bloodthirsty villains, and prevented an onslaught on the house, for after riding around and shooting off a few guns, they departed, carrying with them all the stock they could gather up in the neighborhood, amounting to some 75 or 100 head of cattle, some of which got loose from the Indians and came back home about 3 weeks afterwards. But we will now return to the Hornsby boys and young Kane, who took to the bottom upon seeing the treatment the 2 young men in the other portion of the field had received at the hands of the Indians. Billy was the eldest son, being about 18 or 19 years of age, Malcolm 17, Joe about 15, and Reuben Jr. about 12 years of age, while Kane was about the age of Billy, the oldest. They all broke for the river and swam across, Billy and Malcolm putting Reuben, the youngest, between them in order to assist him. Upon reaching the opposite bank of the river, they struck out for the thickest brush they could find in the bottom, and made their way up the river until arriving at a point about Burdett's old ford. They then swam back across the river and traveled down the same until within about a mile of the home, where they concealed themselves in the brush until sundown, and then went on a little further until they reached an old deserted cabin, where they remained until good dark. Here they picked up some old pieces of saddle skirts or leather, and made temporary soles for the feet of some of the party who had thrown away their shoes or moccasins when they first swam the river. They did not know what had taken place at the house, and they were preparing for a long journey. When the attack was made upon Williams and Haggart, the Indians were so far away from the boys who were working down upon the river bank that they could not tell whether they were Indians or Mexicans. They supposed them to be Mexicans, from the fact that the settlers had but recently been fleeing from them, and the talk of the whole country at that time was more about the war with Mexico than about the Indians. Dark having set in, and the boys by this time being good hungry, they determined to return to the house, see what had become of the family, and if possible get something to eat. Billy and Malcolm were deputized to go to the house, while the others remained concealed in a thicket within a few hundred yards of the house, and within hearing distance. Billy and Malcolm, after agreeing with the other boys upon a designated place to rendezvous in case they should find the house occupied by the enemy, started out on their mission. They approached the house with great caution, expecting to find that the family had all been slaughtered, and the premises probably occupied by Mexicans. As they came near it, they stopped for a while and listened, but hearing no noise, they moved on to the smokehouse. When Malcolm crawled up to the side of the house, peeped through the crack, and seeing there was still something left, reached in and pulled out a piece of meat, and in doing so a board fell off and made quite a little noise. This aroused Mrs. Hornsby, and a slight noise was made inside of the house. The boys were determined to ascertain who the occupants were, so Malcolm threw a rock on the house, whereupon Mrs. Hornsby called to her husband to get up, that the Indians had returned. The voice was at once recognized. The boys made themselves known, and after hallooing to those who were hid in the bushes to come on, walked in the house. The joyful meeting can better be imagined than described, for up to this time neither party knew what had been the fate of the other. It was in the fall or winter of the same year that 3 men, Harris, Blakey, and another man whose name is not known to the writer, came up from Weber's Prairie one day, spent the night at Hornsby's, and staying out the next day to kill a wild fat cow or 2, of which there were a great number ranging on the river at that time, and they belonged to whoever might be lucky enough to kill them. Having crossed the river and passed through the bottom on the opposite side, they soon reached their hunting ground, where, just as Harris and the man whose name is unknown were ascending the bank of a ravine, Blakey somewhat being in the rear, they were fired upon by the Indians and both killed. The Indians scalped them, tore out their entrails, and strewed them on the bushes around. Then they cut off their arms, cut out their hearts, and after going a few rods, they built a fire, where it was supposed from the bones scattered around it, that they had roasted and eaten them. Blakey, who as before stated was in the rear, wheeled his horse when the Indians fired, put spurs to him, and made his escape. Such was the unsettled state of affairs in the Hornsby settlement in 1836. Nor did the Indians cease their murders for many years afterwards in this section of the country, as has been shown, and will be shown further on. Even as late as the year 1845, Daniel Hornsby, another son of Reuben Hornsby, and William Atkinson, a brother of Reverend A.J. Atkinson, who resides in Austin, were brutally murdered by the Indians while fishing on the Colorado River. It was in the month of June 1845 that these two young men left Hornsby's house to have a little fishing frolic all to themselves. They had proceeded up the Colorado River some little distance, and while fishing, some cowardly Indians crawled up behind them and thrust a spear in each of their backs. This caused them to pitch forward into the river, and as they did so the Indians shot several arrows in young Hornsby, producing instant death, and he sank in the river. Atkinson attempted to escape by swimming the stream, and from all appearance he was followed by two of the Indians, as the tracks of two were discovered on the opposite bank of the river. Atkinson reached the opposite shore, and had evidently crawled out some 10 paces, where he breathed his last. From the character of the wounds in his side, it seemed that one of the Indians had swam along by his side, and jagged him in the side with an arrow. After killing and scalping him, they threw him in the river. The Indians then took up the Colorado, and when they had reached about where the cottonseed oil mill now stands, they made representations of 2 coffins in the sand, and stuck an arrow in each, which was evidently intended as a sign for some of their roving companions, indicating the number who had been slain by them. Young Hornsby and Atkinson failing to return at night, search was made for them. The body of Hornsby was found about 1.5 miles from where he was murdered. The body of Atkinson was found right where he was killed. It is hard to realize at this day that Hornsby's Bend, as it is now called, all dotted with beautiful farms and an industrious people, was within less than half a century ago the scene of so many blood-curdling murders at the hands of the Indians. The Reuben Hornsby League is situated not more than 8 or 10 miles below the city of Austin, on the Colorado River, and upon it now reside many of the children and grandchildren of the old pioneer Reuben Hornsby. He has long since passed over the river, but his services rendered in the defense of the frontier will not be forgotten, while there are any of that hardy class left to tell over and over again the scenes and incidents which took place in the early settlements of this country. When the author first made his acquaintance with Reuben Hornsby, his house was the furthest up the Colorado River. His eldest son William, whose name we mentioned above, still lives at a ripe old age, upon his father's Headright League in Travis County. He was in many exciting skirmishes and battles with the Indians at an early day, among which may be mentioned the Battle of Brushy on North Gabriel. He was also in the Cordova fight near Seguin. So that's it for this episode about the attack on Reuben Hornsby's home in the spring of 1836. This attack came at a time when Comanches appeared to have been conducting many raids on the Texas settlers, probably taking advantage of the War of Independence being fought against Mexico. In the coming weeks on this channel, we will read about some women who were captured by a similar large group of Comanches a few weeks before these events, and these attacks occurred further south, between the Nueces River and the Rio Grande. The attack on the Hornsby settlements occurred in the early part of May, and another much more well-known attack would occur further north, near Groesbeck, Texas on May 19, 1836. This was the Comanche raid on the Parker settlement, where many of the forts were killed and Cynthia Parker, Rachel Plummer, and others were taken as captives. This attack was again led by a large group of at least 100 Comanches, and after the Parker raid, the Comanches headed west into the Comancheria country in West Texas and into the mountains in New Mexico and southern Colorado. So it is possible that in 1836, there was a large group of Comanches who first raided in Mexico and the very southern edge of Texas. Then they proceeded north and attacked the Hornsby settlements in early May, and then the Parker settlements on May 19th, with probably many other attacks in between. It's also possible that these were different groups of Indians. This attack in 1836 was certainly not the first time that the Hornsbys had encountered Indians. They would encourage armed men who were traveling through the area to stay at their house, so that it was well fortified against Indian attacks. In 1833, Josiah Wilbarger, the brother of J.W. Wilbarger, the author of this book, stayed with the Hornsbys before he was attacked and scalped by Comanches the next day, but he barely managed to survive. As he lay scalped and possibly dying, his sister, who had just died that day in Missouri, came to him in a dream and told him to stay there and she would get help. She then came to Mrs. Sarah Hornsby in a dream and showed her what had happened to Josiah. After this happened twice, Sarah awoke her husband Reuben and the other men at their home, and they went out and found Josiah Wilbarger just where Sarah had told them he would be. So that is some history of some of the earliest pioneers of Texas. Miss Cynthia Kastner, who was also there that day, was the daughter of Isaac Kastner, who was one of the first settlers of Bastrop, Texas. The Hornsby's oldest son, William, married Lucinda Burleson, who was also from Bastrop, and I believe she is somehow related to Edward Burleson, who was the third vice president of the Republic of Texas from 1841 to 1844, when Sam Houston was serving his second, though non-consecutive term as president. Let us know what you think about these events in the comments, and if you have any info about some of the people from this story. This channel is called Unworthy History because we focus on presenting actual history that has been cast aside as unworthy to show on history channels on TV. Here on this channel, we focus on reading actual history directly from old books, written by people whose shoes we are unworthy to stand in. If you'd like to support our efforts to keep actual history alive, then you can join our Patreon page or become a YouTube channel member. Members will have full access to our members-only videos, and your contribution will be recognized at the end of each episode. So if you want to see more episodes like this, then be sure to like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time on Unworthy History.